history has to be rewritten with the understanding of who is creating the money supply and who's buying those politicians. Otherwise, historians just study the front men. Caesar, here's Napoleon, here's Adolf Hitler, whatever. Why are they in power? Who's funded their rise? Follow the money and you find out. It was extraordinary, the little plot of real estate in central Tokyo had the same market value as the entire state of California.
Central banking being like the arsonist pretending to be the firefighter, right? They create this catastrophe and then they come in and say, here's the way to clean it up. And of course, the way to clean it up completely favors further centralization of their power and control.
It was the Bank of Japan. It was the window guidance and the key guys at the Bank of Japan deciding this. He's been selected as future governor. He'll be governor of the Bank of Japan. These princes were selected so early on. This is how you run a cartel. This is how you run organized crime. Mm-hmm. It's about loyalty.
So this is kind of the same reasons we have dead presidents on United States dollar bills. There's still this imprinting of political credibility onto financial instruments today.
If you are in a certain field and then the sort of fundamental issues remain obscure, that definitely is a red flag. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be the expert in this question. Their official view is, we don't know what money is.
Thank you for making the trip all the way here to Miami from, I think you flew in from Budapest, you said last night.
It's a great pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Fantastic to be here with you.
Yeah. We had a wonderful dinner last night here at the house. I wish we had recorded all of that because you were sharing so many amazing stories just about your life experience, your career, obviously in banking and in money. And as a natural place to start, which is the namesake of the show and something you said, a question you had posed to many people early on in your career, what is money? So if I could ask you, Richard, what is money?
Exactly. And in fact, in the 1990s, when I was chief economist at Jardine Fleming Securities based in Tokyo, I would, my audience were the largest institutional investors in the world. And I was asked to, you have the smaller one-to-one client presentations, but also bigger events and speeches. And essentially, I always had to start with that question. So I was known for being the one who asked, what is money? And they were actually quite intrigued by that because most other people essentially just adopted the standard approach and paradigm, which is not to question, the current or the sort of topical definition of money, which itself has been quite obscure. Because if you look into economics textbooks, then the official result is, money is defined by its functions, but what it does. But mainly when it comes to the point, so how do you measure it? Mm-hmm. If you want to do empirical work, you need actual data series. So what data series are we using? Mm-hmm. They would say things like, it's very complex. And nowadays with, complex derivatives and financial market deregulation, nobody knows what money is. We don't know what money is, but it's really not that important. Let's move on. And that always, it was a red flag. Mm-hmm. If you are in a certain field and then the sort of fundamental issues remain obscure, that definitely is a red flag. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be the expert in this question. Their official view is, there's a quote I have in my presentation, which is something like, we don't know what money is. Of course, it's written in central banking language. Mm-hmm. In all its meanings and definitions, we cannot define money. We don't know what money is, which is a joke. I mean, the Fed claims we don't know what money is, but that's been used essentially to hide the real answers. Mm-hmm. In my work, I came to the conclusion after quite a few years looking into it and working with it, that it's possible to define money. It's just not what the mainstream theories say, and it's not what the central banks would like us to use as money. The central banks, for practical purposes, because they don't want to be nailed down to, particular definitions, they give us a menu. Well, maybe money is M0, also known as M0, high-powered money, monetary base, or narrow money. I mean, it's got like more than half a dozen names for the same thing.
Yes.
Defined as a bank's reserves at the central bank plus cash and currency in circulation. That's M0. And which is kind of interesting if you start there, with the smallest M. Of course, then we have M1, M2, M3, M4, all the other M's. If you compare just to M1, suddenly they drop reserves, bank's reserves at the central bank, and it's essentially sight deposits, current accounts, very short-term deposits at banks. And so, well, why is that? And why are reserves dropped? So it does give you a hint already. There is something about the banking system that has to do with the definition of money. But they don't really expand on that. And so then from M1, M2, M3, M4 onwards, you just add other deposits, longer term deposits, savings deposits. The trouble with that is because essentially you're measuring private sector assets that are savings. It's a subset of private sector savings. Savings held in banks in various forms, various maturities. Well, where's the limit? Why not include non-bank savings? In fact, there are people who've said, and there's definitions that also look at other assets and instruments owned by the private sector, held outside the banking system. And then where do you draw the line? The maturity can get longer. Well, then why not all sorts of things, stocks, real estate, anything is actually potential money, because that's really what we're talking about. And that's the trouble with this traditional approach to defining money. All the M's, they focused on money that's actually out of circulation, money that's potential money, but at the moment of measurement, we know for sure it's not actually being spent. It's out of circulation. So that's very unsatisfactory, and has empirically, when you try to use that, has not been that successful. And there have been some puzzles in macroeconomics, for example, that these M definitions of money, M1, M2, M3, or even M0, they're supposed to be in a stable relationship with the economy, economic growth.
Which of course they're not.
From the quantity equation. But that broke down this stable relationship. And so in this, quantity equation, you've got also...
Is that PV equals MQ?
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got velocity in there, the
right,
V.
which is a plug.
Exactly. It's like the residual.
Yeah.
Linking MV, money, whatever, M1, M2, M3, whatever you want to use then. So this M times a constant or some kind of stable factor.
Velocity, the number of times it changed hands, but yeah.
Originally comes from this idea gold coins going around, how fast are they going around, right? But of course, there's no more gold in circulation. So, and then on the other side, you've got nominal GDP. P times Y is just the price level times real GDP. Y, the abbreviation for real GDP, real income. Yeah. But the I for income had been used for investment already when Keynes did this. Yeah. So then he used Y for real income multiplied by the price level gives you nominal income, which is nominal GDP. So really we're saying very simply, money, which is nominal, times something, velocity, a constant, equals nominal GDP. Right. And that worked in the 1950s and 60s, which is why monetarism got a boost. And then Milton Friedman was quite successful in marketing the monetarist approach, which is very much focused on this quantity equation. But it basically broke down in the 70s and even worse in the 80s. And ever since, this relationship had broken down. The velocity had become unstable. And there's three different names for that. It's the velocity decline. You see a literature on, particularly in the 80s, on this puzzle of the velocity decline. But the same thing can be expressed as if you look at the Cambridge equation over at the other university. And I was at Oxford, so we don't mention the name. It's called the other university. And the same in Cambridge, of course, when you talk about Oxford. So at the other university, people had formulated the so-called Cambridge equation, dare I say it, and that's simply solving for money and putting velocity as 1 over v on the other side, which they called little k, renaming it. This is another economist trick, named after Marshall, the Marshallian k, which, when stock market analysts use quite a lot. And there's a little bit of truth in there for a reason I come to in a moment. But the idea is that this M now is called the money demand function. They just say that's money demand, okay? And that's now a function of still nominal GDP, but with the factor now on the other side, the V is, 1 over V is renamed K. And so the velocity decline and velocity instability is the same as to say the money demand function has become unstable. And so they had these stable money demand functions they've been estimating, and then it didn't work. So all this stuff basically didn't work. And as usual in economics, as you get more sophisticated in your mathematical formulations, the actual value added seems to be rapidly declining.
Yes.
Because then also the data, why being so super sophisticated? I mean, this is a simple one, but of course there are much more complex ones, but the data may be even worse. And then what's the point? Now, there's a third way of referring to this puzzle, and that one gives us some good hints. In the 70s, some economists referred to this, because that's when the velocity decline happened first, this relationship between money and the economy, GDP, didn't seem to be there anymore. And they talked about the mystery of the missing money. Now, that was de-emphasized because basically it gives you too many clues. The mystery of the missing money, why? Well, because basically the money supply was rising a lot in the 70s. And we're not supposed to talk about it because the inflation is supposed to be in the 70s inflation, half a century ago, supposed to be due to the oil shock, oil in the Middle East and all that.
And at this time, this was still when they were saying that central banks did not create money, right? Was this that argument still being made?
I mean, probably the textbooks will say central banks create money, but banks don't create money. And the central banks, well, maybe, yes, they can create money, but essentially somehow they can only supply the money that's demanded, and there's limited demand for money or some story like that. I mean, I faced that in Japan quite a lot when the central bank was creating this 20-year recession. And then throughout, the central bank claimed, well, nobody wants our money. So, you can just, and they quote this Keynes expression, you can only lead a horse to the water. You can't force it to drink. We can only offer the money, but nobody's taking it, which always was complete nonsense. Whenever they said that, like in public meetings, they would say, well, here's my Japanese bank account number.
Send me some.
I will take it. I will take it gladly. Thank you. They never send any. So there's so much propaganda in economics, as you will have discovered.
Of course. Can we then, because last night you were telling me this very interesting story about the origin of the term stockbroker and tally sticks and this being like a proto form of money, also related, I think, to the genesis of the state in a way, right? The way this hierarchical relationship was arranged. Could you go into that as like a precursor
In fact,
to all of this modern monetary alchemy?
So, and then because then we can come full circle and actually, when you analyze the historical development of money, what money really is, then we can apply to the current system and our days, and then we will have a definition of what money is, and it's usable. I've been using it in my econometric work. It works very well, but of course you come to conclusions that the powers that be don't like. The central planners at the central banks, they've been investing a lot of resources in basically hiding the true answer to the questions you've been asking, what is money? They're all about constantly distracting you with other things. And that's not interesting. Let's not go there. Look here, and there's this and that and the other. So there's an awful lot of that being going on. And of course, the central banks have had a very significant impact on the development of economics.
Of course.
Academic economics, research economics, published economics in refereed learned journals, and also very clearly concerning textbooks and what is taught at universities. There's a good article I mentioned yesterday in the Huffington Post, 2009, called "How the Fed Bought the Economics Profession," and it's definitely one of the achievements, if you want to put it that way, of the central banks, that they have really managed over the decades to control the economics profession, academic economics, the teaching of economics. And by that, they've influenced so many people, people's thinking, how they approach this. And so ultimately that's helped them in hiding the truth. So the truth about money has been very much hidden, buried, basically. And you can make a good career if you play ball and don't ask the difficult questions.
Participate in the lie.
There's a famous quote from, there was unfortunately passed away a few years ago, a Belgian economist called Bernard Lietaer. And he was a PhD student at the MIT, together with Paul Krugman, was his fellow PhD student. You know, it's a bit like me at Oxford doing the MPhil and then doctorate, DPhil. My fellow student was Mark Carney, who's now the Prime Minister of Canada for some strange reason, because he wasn't elected to be Prime Minister of Canada. And before, of course, he was Bank of England governor and the Canadian Central Bank governor. Anyway, so he was saying, they had this conversation, Paul Krugman and him had this conversation. And Bernard Lietaer is somebody, when you look at his work, he's always talking about money. He realized money is so important. How can people not actually discuss how we define money? How do we shape the institutions that deal with money? It affects everything. It's so important, you know? So he was very much on the right track there. But Paul Krugman told him, you keep going on about money. And there's this video clip where Bernard Lietaer basically relates that and tells his audience about what Krugman told him, fellow student Krugman. He said, Bernard, you know, you keep going on about money. Haven't they told you? Don't touch the money thing. You won't get invited to the important dinners. It's not going to be good for your career.
Crazy.
And so this essentially sums up the reality. So if you've toe the party line and don't question the money thing, then you can have a great career as an economist, as a professor of economics. You can publish in top journals, you get promoted.
Yeah, they turn you into economics rock stars, as you were saying last night.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Suddenly, these people with books that can be quite shallow or quite meaningless, really, when it comes to reality, then become these economics rock star economists, or they become governor of a central bank. That's the other major reward. And so they do have these rewards, and that seems to work for a lot of people. So they just play ball, and that is, of course, the answer to this other mystery. You know, I mean, we agree money is important, and we'll try to get to the bottom of it. But you know, why aren't more people asking this question? And how come there's all these learned scholars, economists, and experts in even monetary economics, and they don't ask the question, how is that even possible? So because some people can say, well, hang on, there surely can't be anything new we can discover because we have these experts and they tell us there's nothing to see here. Well, they're being paid off to see nothing and not to ask these questions. But to come back to your question of the historical roots, and you're referring to the old English system. Actually, you started with the Normans, the Norman Exchequer. That's one very important historical development where we have very good records. There may be many other historical developments we just don't have good records of them, but this one we have very good records. The other one is, of course, the Chinese monetary system, which started, they had the first paper money, started in the 10th century. And then we have good descriptions, our own. The Chinese have their own description and they're ancient scholars, but we also have Western descriptions. Marco Polo, in his very readable and amusing book, usually translated as The Travels. In the original Italian version, it was more like the world that he described, that he experienced after 20 years working for Kublai Khan, the great Khan of Khans and Emperor of China. And he personally dealt with him, because he spoke fluent Mongolian, because it was his second visit when he was there first, when he was 16 years old, because traveling there takes, 2 years. On the way, he picked up Mongolian, and then Kublai Khan took a liking He was always interested in Western things and Christianity, by the way. So his mission actually was to. So when they met for the first time, he said to Marco Polo and his father, who Marco Polo was translating. His father was there, and his uncle, so his father's brother. Kublai Khan sent them back. Go back, you Latins. Go back to your Latin country. Go back to the head of all your Latin countries in Rome. Your big head, the big chief, the Pope. He was referring to, and tell him the Khan of Khans, the Emperor of China, is interested in Christianity. Send 300 of your best theologians. They will debate my theologians, and I will back them. Well, he didn't say that part, but we know from our records, he actually was very sympathetic. He was going to back them. And there was a chance, and he said that, if they convinced them, and of course, being the Khan of Khans, he could help in the discussion, the entire Mongolian Empire will become Christian. That was the offer. Unfortunately, when Marco Polo went back and his father, the Pope was not interested. There was a second Pope. There was, all these wars and conflict. So it never happened. But he did come back because, he'd invited them back. And of course, it was great for trading. And then he stayed on for 20 years. Now, he describes there the monetary system that they had in China, which is the other system. So we've got the Norman Exchequer in England, 12th century. And we have Marco Polo's 13th century description of the Mongolian system. And the third one, slightly older, perhaps we should start there, and I'll try to be brief on this, is the Babylonian system. It is older. We are talking about almost 5,000 years ago. But the three systems have a lot of similarities. They're essentially the same system, and they have the sort of features which were then used and abused by private entrepreneurs to create the system that we have today. Because these were all state or government money systems. Because ultimately, when we're talking about money, it's also a question of, okay, who creates it? Once you agree what it is, who creates it? Who has the power to create and allocate money? Which clearly gives you enormous economic and therefore also political power and power over everything and power over the media. With the money, you can buy anything. Politicians, media, PR,
Yes,
support.
like as if purchasing power is the most fundamental power that you can buy. Political power, you can buy narrative power,
you can buy
ideological
armies,
power,
you can buy your military
power, yes. In Bitcoin, we often dream about the idea of forming citadels, which are independent, self-sovereign communities that have their own energy, food, and water resources. Today, that dream is becoming a reality at the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a 705-acre regenerative agriculture community located at the Florida-Georgia line near Folkston, Georgia. The farm is known as the healthiest place on earth, and it includes orchards, organic standing gardens, regenerative animal pastures, berry fields, and much, much more. Today, the farm features 25 custom-built cabins and has plans to construct 225 more in the years ahead. The farm has its own food, energy, and water sources and is completely off-grid. So if you're looking to join a Citadel community comprised of sovereign individuals, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about membership. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on custom cabin pricing. Again, that's okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer, so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove.
And so ordinary people, and I've confirmed this with a big survey, believe, this is the actual belief out there, that, and they sense, well, money clearly is very important. Everyone knows that. Common sense, you don't need to be a scholar. Therefore, surely this is controlled by the government. That's people's assumption. I did a survey with my students in Frankfurt. Inner Frankfurt, over 1,000, results in this survey, over 1,000 people. We had the questionnaires filled out, and I found that 84% of the population, and this is probably above average, central Frankfurt, where you've got the ECB and the Bundesbank and the financial institutions and universities, believe that the majority of the money supply is created and allocated by the government or the central bank. But that's not true. That's not the system we have. So really, it's wishful thinking, or people just assume that surely something as important as that, the government is in charge. Otherwise, there can't be any democracy. And if not, surely somebody would have stepped in and pointed this out. Well, that's where all the propaganda comes in and the controlled narrative we have in economics. So the system we have is not what people believe we have. That's the first point, isn't it? So there is something very important to see here, and that's why they say don't stay here, don't look at this, just move on. Let's talk about something else. So the old system was such a system where the government was in control, and the government was creating, allocating the money supply. It started in Babylon with the temples. Why? Because the king would put his gold treasure in the temple. And we have lots of descriptions of that in the Bible. It was also true for the Israelites. Once they had the temple, the treasure was kept in the temple. Whenever there's another war and some loot was taken, be put in the treasury after everyone gets paid, whatever their due. And so that was the system. So people knew, okay, in the treasury, in the temple was the treasury. That's where the gold was. Now, actually, it was in 2007. A scholar, Michael Josa from Vienna, translated one of those clay tablets we have. You see, from Babylon, we have good records because they used to write on clay.
Right.
And then when things get burned down and cities get burned down, the clay actually just got hardened and survived.
Right.
So we have all these records, tens of thousands of clay records. They're mostly in the British Museum. You wonder why, but and mostly they still haven't been translated. And so one of them he found, which I thought was particularly relevant, is sort of this big. It's tiny in Assyrian cuneiform writing.
Yeah, the Babylonian cuneiform, right? Yeah.
Yes. And this one created headlines because he found the name of the chief official, which is like the prime minister of King Nebuchadnezzar II, being mentioned there by name, Nebuchadnezzar, and that's been mentioned in the Old Testament, Jeremiah, and nowhere else have we found such a record. So people would say, well, that's just the Bible story. But it turns out that throwaway detail in the Bible is accurate. And so scholars were amazed. And that's why actually in Britain, it was a number one page headline, front page headline in the newspapers with the picture. And of course, for a researcher and money, it was really interesting because what did this clay tablet say? It said that I, Nebuchadnezzar II, and my chief official Nebusarsekim have deposited the equivalent of something like 750 grams of gold in the temple in Babylon. And that was the receipt for having deposited it.
It's like the original banknote.
Yes. Yes. Now, the question, of course, is, and I always ask my student that question, you show the picture of that. And I asked them, well, why does this even exist? Why does this receipt exist? Do you really think that King Nebuchadnezzar the Great, king of Babylon, when he feels like, oh, I want to go shopping, I'm going to get some gold out of the temple, 750 grams. When he walks up to the temple with his entourage, the king is coming. All the high priests and temple priests and staff, attendants, they all fall down, surely flat, face to the ground, not even allowed to look at the king. And he waltzes into the temple, hushed silence. And he says, I'm withdrawing 750 grams of gold. Do you think any of these temple priests and attendants will say, lying down, Sire, hast thou brought thy deposit receipt with thee? No, surely not. In other words, the king doesn't, and his prime minister, they don't need this deposit receipt. Why does it even exist? And that's where, of course, we come to the sort of the hidden history of money. Because, when archaeologists dig, they find coins. Okay, that was their money. Here's the answer to your question. What is money? It's a gold coin. It's a silver coin. It's a bronze coin. Well, we know from Babylonian records that coinage, which was the first coinage we have records of is the 7th century BC. Coinage came much later than this temple system, which actually was a full-blown credit system, a full-blown banking system. Because the temple banks were giving loans. They were conducting cash-free, these were essentially gyro bank transfers, cashless transactions, collateralized loans, uncollateralized loans. You had, all the standard banking transactions, deposits, withdrawals. But the system, so essentially it was modern banking. And so here the question is, well, what is banking? How do banks work? And strangely, even for the last 100 years, the scholars haven't even agreed on that. There have been 3 theories of banking. And they've been arguing, banks are just financial intermediaries. There's nothing happening there. This is still the dominant theory, the financial intermediation theory of banking. They just gather deposits, do their analysis, credit research and whatever, and then they lend money. These deposits are being lent out. That's the current official view. Central banks supported. All the textbooks have it. The leading finance journals have only that theory, economics journals. And of course, by the way, they use that argument to drop banking from economics models. So in standard macroeconomics models, you don't have banks in them. And there's no other, because there's no real function for banks. They're just intermediaries, but they don't do anything. Money is created, well, they say by the central bank, which the public likes to hear because that's what they think is happening. But the reality is central bank money creation is only 3% of the money supply. Where are the 97% coming from? Now, there's 2 more theories of banking. And one is the fractional reserve theory of banking. That one, quite a lot of people still remember. It used to be mainstream in the textbooks until the 1960s. And of course that, survived, and some old books have still been used. So a lot of people know about that one. The fractional reserve theory says that each individual bank is just a financial intermediary, just like the financial intermediation theory. You gather deposits, lend out the money, but there's a caveat. As the banks interact with each other, you get money creation in the system. but not individual banks. They're just intermediaries.
Right. Because they're lending out more than their reserves. That's the fractional reserve.
It's a convoluted theory. They relate, essentially they have a narrow measure of money, high-powered money like M0. And then you have a broad measure of money where you say, well, somehow we have all these bank deposits like M2, M3. Well, how's it possible? Here's this narrow M0 and then this broad measure. Where do all these deposits come from? Something's happening. We don't know what's happening for sure. Each individual bank, they're just intermediaries. They're not doing anything. It must be somehow in the system. The money is being created. It is somewhat complex, and people haven't really been convinced by this. And the reason is that this is also wrong. This is not the truth. There's a third theory, and that one says banks create money out of nothing when they engage in what's called bank lending.
Right. So it's like a zero reserve theory. They're just lending it into existence.
And it's each individual bank, you see. So they're not intermediaries.
Right.
They don't take deposits and lend out that money. No, they create the money when they lend. And that creates the deposit. So it's the other way around.
Right.
But to understand that, and actually then to come back to the Babylonian temples and then the other system, maybe let's look at how it started in the modern era, because the same thing happened over and over again in history. And it's also an era where we have fairly good records. It's really 16th, 17th century in England. The general view was, well, money is gold and silver. So when Marco Polo returned to Europe, that's what he was faced with. I mean, he knew money can be paper, and that was a very efficient system. Kublai Khan issued a fiat where he ordered everyone several times a year to bring all their gold to the mint, the government, the treasury, where the money was issued, and they would assess the gold and then pay the value in paper money. So Kublai Khan was amassing all the gold and the silver and the jewelry and everything. So these were the first open market operations, of course, when you acquire assets. And so that's what Marco Polo then...
And this is one of the first fiat currencies, right? Like by decree.
What's the first paper money?
Yeah, you submit your gold and we'll give you this IOU. But the IOU is actually irredeemable, it sounds like.
Well, certainly the Chinese system was the first paper money, but we had clay, we had wood in England. So, and that means, whether it's wood or clay or paper, that's not so important really. So the system has been around. But when Marco Polo came back, he was shocked how, sort of simplistic everyone was thinking about money in Europe, because people thought gold and silver is money. As a result, governments thought, well, we need to pay. We have some expenses. We need to build some bridges here and do some infrastructure investment, pay the army, protect the country, all these expenses. Taxes were quite low, but also rulers were, they're much higher today than they were in medieval times. People shouldn't forget that. We talk about the Dark Ages. Well, taxes were mostly zero for most people in the past. Okay, because the taxes came with the invention of central banks, which is a modern phenomenon in the US only since 1913, right? That's also when they introduced the federal income tax, which didn't exist before.
And passports and the IRS and all.
And it's the same with the foundation of the Bank of England in 1694. It was introduced with an act that talked all about introducing these new taxes. Why? Because the government is supposed to not issue money anymore, but borrow at interest.
Of course. Yeah.
And who's going to pay that interest? Where does it come from? Right. Taxes.
The labor of the taxpayers. Yeah.
That's the link.
That's the collateral for the fiat system.
And so now the rulers, when Marco Polo came back, let's say 13th century, the governments, the princes, the kings thought gold and silver is money. The trouble then is you can't control the money supply. They tried. So they invested a lot in essentially, what's called alchemy. They tried to make gold. And particularly Germany, the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, which is what Germany was before the modern, much smaller versions, this Holy Roman Empire of German nation which of course included, what is nowadays Netherlands, the Low Countries of Germany, Switzerland, before it became, was broken out from there. All these other pieces were broken out from that. But also Northern Italy, was part of it. Milan, Mailand was a city in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. Anyway, so there were 355 principalities in there. So it was always a very decentralized system, which is good for people because, your ruler is local. And then you had this broader, bigger, and the emperor was elected by and among the kings. Now, they all invested in alchemy to create gold.
Yes.
That's, of course, where Germany became the leading force in chemistry. And most of the famous chemists are all Germans, because there was such, over centuries, such heavy investment in alchemy as a byproduct, chemistry.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE.
Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLF, NYC.com. The question, what is money, is all about exposing systems that don't serve us, and healthcare is one of the biggest. 65% of Americans suffer from chronic disease, and the answer isn't more pharmaceuticals. The answer is fixing the root cause. This is exactly why Rivero exists. Co-founded by Dr. Sean Baker, Rivero is an online clinic treating chronic illness through a personalized high-protein diet designed to restore gut health and improve metabolic function. A dedicated care team monitors your progress with regular lab work and daily biomarkers like blood sugar to proactively customize your care plan and nutrition. It's like having a smart clinic in your pocket. Right now, Rivero is offering 10% off your first month. So head over to rivero.com/breedlove. That's REVERO.com/breedlove and start taking sovereignty over your health today. Carl Jung said that alchemy was the dream from which science was born. That actually trying these methods, systemizing these methods to try and create gold led to the scientific method, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
Intriguingly, the alchemists did point to mercury as the substance that could perhaps be turned into gold. And we know with nuclear physics, that's true. That's the only substance. And we can do it nowadays, but the process is so expensive.
Very expensive, yes.
You just, you don't bother. So as a result, the rulers, they didn't give up. They still worked on it, but they realized, okay, we're not getting results that we can immediately use. So what do? Well, we have to get gold from somewhere. And this is where this other development happened. Because if gold is your money supply, of course, there is a big problem with that, the risk. Just think about nowadays. If I'm in say, London, a major city, I would not want to walk around with a lot of gold on me.
Sure.
And the police will advise you, don't do that. And that's 21st century.
Yeah.
So imagine, say, 13th, 14th century.
Right.
No, you don't want to walk around with this gold.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Because it's a bearer asset and can be seized, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So, and of course, you know, there is crime, there is violence. So what do you do? And what people did was, well, they realized, well, we have to put this gold where it's safe. But where is it safe? Ultimately, it's safe where, and that's what they found, with somebody who has gold already themselves, and that they don't need to steal my gold, so I can deposit it with them. They work with gold. They have their own private army in the safe to, you know, and private army to protect it, you know, security people. So why don't I put it there? And these were the goldsmiths, you know, they're working with gold, making jewelry for rich people, for the aristocracy, for the king. And that's what happened. Now, of course, you do need, when you place your gold with them, okay, I've got this gold bar here, you know, I want you to look after, I'll pay you a small fee. You do need a receipt. Not because you distrust the goldsmith, but just for practical reasons. Well, accounting, one, exactly. But also, you know, the goldsmith may get ill or may have a bad memory. It's like you need the record to make that claim. Or what if the goldsmith dies and somebody, you know, his son takes over? You need a record to say this is my gold. So goldsmith deposit receipts came about. And the next step is also quite logical, because if, you know, let's say we're neighbors and you've got more land than you need, I'd like to build a little hut. I need a bit of land. And we come to an agreement, I buy this piece of land from you. It's how much? Okay, we agree on the price. Right, now, everything agreed. Okay, I want to pay you now. I can go to the city and there's the goldsmith. That's where my gold is. I can get the gold. Now I have to walk back, travel back, depending on how far that is.
Risk.
It's going to be risky. Yeah. I'll give it to you. What are you going to do with
Walk it back and
if there's a
deposit it.
chance, exactly, you'll bring it back to the same goldsmith. Listen, why don't I just give you my deposit receipt?
Yeah.
In fact, to make up the sum, okay, here's 3 deposit receipts of this money, and it's yours. And and everyone thinks that's better, that's more efficient, makes sense.
So the credit instrument becomes monetized at that point.
Now, at this point, actually, nothing much happened, because the gold is stored and the deposit receipts, which are one-to-one linked to the stored gold, are used for transactions. That's actually quite efficient. And in a way, you know, you've addressed the security problem.
Yes.
And nothing much else happens.
I often say, sorry to just, I say this point a lot, but it perfectly mirrors what you're saying here, that one good definition of money is that it's a device for moving purchasing power across space and time. And so in gold, we had something that's really good at moving purchasing power across time because it's a good savings technology. But for all the reasons you're highlighting here, the physicality of gold invites certain risk, you know, opens you up to the threat of violence, coercion, etc. So we innovated around that basically by putting the gold on deposit with a goldsmith and then taking this deposit receipt that's much more portable, right? Much lower risk to transact in this, or what would later become an electronic representation of that deposit receipt or banknote. And so we gained the ability to have, to move purchasing power across space really well with a gold linked currency.
Right.
And so, so it's great. That's a great monetary instrument, works really well, but it introduces this need to trust the custodian.
Yes. But this is really just where the story starts. That's the starting point. And really, we've become more efficient and we've become clever about it. There's, you know, good use of this instrument to transfer purchasing power. Great. Now imagine what the goldsmiths were saying. And of course, in those days, every profession, they were organized in guilds. They would meet regularly and they'd talk shop, literally. You know, all the carpenters. And they had, of course, also their business because they're running quality control. They were examining people to become master of their trade, to then be allowed to practice. You know, that's the system, the guild system. And so the goldsmiths, when they get together, they were talking to each other and they noticed, well, hang on, you know, nobody's picking up this gold. Actually, you know, withdrawals are quite rare because, have you noticed, they're using our receipts to pay. This creates temptations.
Yes.
What is the temptation? Well, at the same time, of course, people realize, well, these goldsmiths, that's where the gold is. So let's say you need some money. Where do you go? You go to the goldsmith. That's where the gold is. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were, of course, going to the goldsmiths. Now, the goldsmiths were very much aware of the laws, and they were dealing with authorities and, kings and princes. So, of course, they, had to be careful. They would want to be within the law. And the law said, this was European law until 330 years ago in most European countries, charging interest is forbidden. It was illegal. But the people were coming to the goldsmiths and saying, can I borrow some gold? I'll pay you interest. Now, that created immediately this temptation that the goldsmiths were exposed to, and essentially they gave in. Okay, we'll lend out some of the gold at interest. And of course, it has to be secret for two reasons. Number one, charging interest was illegal. Number two, and it wasn't a minor thing, in the Bible, charging interest in the list of sins, it is a capital sin right after murder. Murder is higher, and then comes charging interest. Wow.
Yes. Yeah.
So it wasn't a minor thing. But secondly, it had to be kept secret because you didn't want the depositors to realize
It's
that
not their gold, really.
Some of the gold is not there. It's no longer deposited. Because really, this was a breach of contract now.
Yes, you're violating. They're reaping the reward, but putting the risk on the depositor.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens is three things. Number one, breach of contract. The moment the goldsmith lends out money as a loan to somebody at interest. Breach of contract plus breach of the law, you're charging interest. An attractive business model comes about because you're charging for time, because interest accumulates over time. You don't have to do anything. Normally, if you start a business and you want to grow it, as you grow the business, you have to put in more resources. You've got some costs. And this is not true with interest.
Right.
So that's the second thing. It's a business model where you just sit back, and as time goes by, you get more and more money. That's attractive.
Yes.
But thirdly, the money supply is expanding. Because the moment the goldsmiths were lending out some of the gold, it wasn't anymore this one-to-one relationship between the deposits, the gold deposit not circulating, and instead its image, the receipt circulating. So there's no macroeconomic implication. But the moment you lend out some of the gold, you've expanded the money supply. There's now in total more purchasing power, chasing.
And aren't
things.
they lending to the actual paper receipts rather than the physical gold?
Well, you're talking about the next step.
Okay.
This is what happens next. Because, of course, the goldsmiths were smart, as you are. And they realized, well, I guess a few meetings down the road, they realized, okay, we've got to be careful. We shouldn't lend out all this gold, And they also realized, by the way, we need to collaborate. Because if somebody gets more demands, we need to collude.
Yeah.
So if somebody needs gold because they're, trying to, hand in their deposit receipts and get the gold out, the other goldsmiths need to help.
Yeah.
So there you create essentially the interbank market. The banks have to work together. It's still true today. Banking is a network industry, and banks have to constantly collaborate very closely.
Yeah.
If the automobile industry is very different. Turn on my BMW, it'll work no matter what Mercedes-Benz is doing, but not in banking. You can't do even a simple transfer in most cases if the other banks or particular banks are not cooperating. It is a network industry, so that's a big difference. And so the goldsmiths realized that, okay, we'll work together. But they also realized, and I guess a smart goldsmith had this idea, hang on, we don't need to lend the gold. I'll show you guys next time. This guy always comes around every Monday and wants a loan and so far. I've given it. I'll give it to him today, and I'll show you what we're going to do. So this guy comes around. Oh, please, I need this money. I'm bothering you again as the last few weeks. I need these 200 grams of gold. I need to pay this and that. And the goldsmith say, okay, I've listened to you, and you've been very consistent, and I think, okay, well, we can do it. Here's the usual contract with the small print, here's the interest, repayment schedule, collateral, your house, your wife, your 2 daughters, collateral. They will be sold into slavery, obviously, if you don't pay, the usual. But one more thing, it's a small thing, it won't bother you. Here's the gold, you see. I'll give it to you. I want you to deposit it with me once you've borrowed it. Oh, but I need the gold. Yes, and of course, once you've deposited with me, I give you the deposit receipt. Ah, okay. And yes, you can use the depository as everyone is doing.
It's accepted by all the other banks in town too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, fine. That's fine. We'll do that. And so what happens now is much more dramatic. What we have is, this is no longer breach of contract. This is outright fraud. Why is it fraud? Because the goldsmith is now issuing a fictitious deposit receipt.
Right.
Of course, the fiction is,
it's a liability with no asset behind it. Basically.
Well, here's the gold. The goldsmith lends the borrower the gold to then deposit it, and then gets the deposit receipt. So on the surface, it seems proper. This is what double entry accounting was invented for. Because in double entry accounting, you can make this appear proper when actually it is fraud. Because you create an asset and a liability at the same time, you lengthen the balance sheet. But really, this is fraud. Why is it fraud? Because you can prove it's fraud in 2 ways. Number one, the guy who goes to the goldsmith, before he borrows the gold, check. Does this guy have any gold on him? No. Then he leaves the goldsmith with a receipt that confirms he's deposited gold. Well, how did that happen? He didn't have any on him, right? Secondly, check the total amount of gold at the goldsmith. He's issued more deposit receipts now, but has the total amount of gold stored at the goldsmith increased? No. Of course, they will say, well, we work together with the other goldsmiths. Somehow we can, we it's an interbank liability, and don't worry.
The truth is expressed in the ratio, right? That the liabilities have increased, but the assets have not. So
in double entry, everything is increased. That's why the double entry accounting
But that's the
works.
Illusory part, right?
Yes.
Because it's assets equals liabilities plus equity. Actual liabilities have increased.
The loan is the asset.
Yeah.
And the deposit is created the moment the loan is extended. The borrower's account at the bank is credited with the amount of money. So, but let me come to this. So this is now fraud. Secondly, the business model has just got even more attractive because you can now get revenue, get interest on income streams, and your cost is simply writing a deposit receipt.
And your risk is zero too. If they default on it, it's not even your gold that you lent out.
There are some things they have to watch out, but that again, if they collude with each other, they can manage these risks. And thirdly, the money supply now can really be expanded. And that's something you have to watch. And there are macroeconomic consequences, depending on what the money is used for. I'll come to that. That's my quantity theory of disaggregated credit, where you have to look at the money creation and its use. Because not all money creation leads to inflation. It depends. There's 3 scenarios, but I'll come back to that. And so the money supply expands, the third thing. And fourthly, a fourth thing happens. Banking is born. This is modern banking. Now, that is also explained by this third theory of banking, the credit creation theory of banking. So as I said, we have 3 theories. The financial intermediation theory, there's no money creation. Banks are just gathering deposits, lending them out. You have the fractional reserve theory, which is a bit of a mixture. It says each individual bank is just an intermediary. Nothing much to see here. But somehow, yes, there is somehow money creation in the system as they interact in a slightly dubious sort of process. That's not fully convincing when they explain. And thirdly, there is this credit creation theory, and that says banks are not financial intermediaries. Each individual bank creates money. Banks are creators of the money supply. And each bank creates money, how and when? When it gives out a loan. Now, I thought this is quite curious that we've had over the last century and a bit these 3 theories of banking. And economists argue about this, which one is it? And people, of course, the majority nowadays supports the financial intermediation theory. There's nothing to see here. Banks are just intermediaries, no money creation. But some economists would say, well, hang on, there's credit creation going on. So you do get these arguments. And of course, over the 20th century, you had different proponents of different theories. Schumpeter was supporting the credit creation theory. The fractional reserve theory was pushed by Keynes in 1930, although earlier he was aware and had supported the credit creation theory. And then later he would switch further even to the financial intermediation theory in his 1936 general theory. So it's very suspect what Keynes has been doing, moving further and further away from the truth. And then, of course, from the 60s, they've been pushing this financial intermediation theory. Tobin was asked to set up a whole new journal called Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, which by its title, you'd assume must be all about this. And anyone who discovers a bit of truth or realizes there's something about banks and credit, well, that seems like the right journal to look up. But no, it's completely ideological. It's all about banks don't create money. Banks are just financial intermediaries. That's how this was really pushed in the last few decades. And central banks, of course, have been pushing this hard. Therefore, we can drop banks from macroeconomic models. When the 2008 crisis happened, the banking crisis happened.
Yeah.
The truth was, if the journalists interviewed an economist at, say, Harvard, MIT, or central bank economist, had they honestly answered, they would have said, well, sorry, I can't answer your question about the banking crisis. Why not? You're an expert. You're this famous professor of economics. Well, yeah, but our economic theories don't include banks. So how can I comment? That would have been the honest answer. Obviously, they were making up some stuff. They didn't want to admit that. But that's been the reality in these macroeconomic models. So,
and so that's by design, right? As you said, to exclude banking from economic models, basically to make them invisible and not subject to scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this whole process of money creation, credit creation by banks should be invisible. But I thought, the scientific thing is to actually test these three theories of banking. And so I conducted the first empirical test, which is written up and published. It's the most downloaded paper of all Elsevier publications. One is called, and I made it open source, so you can just Google it, you'll get it. Can banks individually create money out of nothing? And the second one that was published 2014, and the second one published 2016 is Lost Century in Economics, because for the past century, this has been denied.
The same century of central banking. What did Ron Paul say? That it's no coincidence that the century of total war is also the century of central banking, is also this lost century of economics.
Yes, exactly. Lost economics, the lost century of lost century for economics is not economic truth. And also the century of rising taxes. All these things happen together. Warfare, taxes, centralization, central controls coming in. I did this test. I needed a bank to collaborate with me. And I found a bank, and I actually took out a loan, 200,000 euros in Europe, in a bank that was very representative because it was a cooperative bank, which is the largest number of banks are cooperative banks in Europe.
And what does that mean, cooperative?
Cooperative. It's like a...
cooperative.
Cooperative. Yeah. It's the governance structure of the bank is like a stakeholder bank.
Got it.
So it's not for profit, strictly speaking. It's for its members. And that's the largest number of banks in Europe are cooperative banks. Okay. Germany has by far the largest, but also Austria, Switzerland, Italy, lots of these cooperative banks. And in Germany, they all use the same system, the same IT, obviously the same accounting. In Europe anyway, it's all standardized auditing rules and everything. So we know this is representative. I borrowed the 200,000 euros and I wanted to transfer it out of the bank. And the question was, where did the money come from when I received the loan? We actually had the BBC there filming on the day. And I had all the bankers in the room, and we watched them, what they were doing, and they showed us the internal, their system. And I could demonstrate, and they actually even signed that, confirming that the money for my loan did not come from deposits. It did not come from reserves. They didn't even check their reserves. They made no transfer of this money from either inside or outside the bank. It was newly added because really the legal view of this makes it actually quite clear. Banks are not, economists always say banks are deposit-taking institutions that lend money. That's not true. The legal reality is banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. They don't take deposits because at law in England, where modern banking was created with the arrival of the Bank of England, the laws were also put in place. And at law, there is no such thing as a bank deposit. It doesn't exist. At law, the status of a depositor is simply a general creditor. It's a loan to the bank.
Right.
So deposits are actually our loans to the bank.
Right.
The tables are turned.
Right. And this is in the fine print of online banking agreements, even in the US, that you're not the customer, actually, you're the creditor to the bank.
Yes, that's right.
And they're the borrower.
Exactly.
And they can default on you.
Exactly.
Yes.
So on the one hand, we lend them the money, so they're the borrower. Then what about when they do what we call lending to us? Well, actually, what they do is they purchase our promise to pay. Our loan contract is a promissory note that we've issued. We've issued a security, an IOU. The bank buys it, and then it owes us money, right? Oh, but that's called a deposit when they owe us money, right? So they invent a new deposit because actually in accounting terms, you've studied accounting and audit, the accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract for the bank is now fraudulently, essentially, misrepresented as another type of liability called customer deposit. And that's what it is.
Right.
And that's all it is. And that's how money is invented. That's how banks create money. So I could prove that. And so now it's established. Actually, there's two tests. Another test, this Lost Century in Economics paper. But I could prove empirically, peer-reviewed journal, it's no longer a matter of dispute that banks create money. And this is how, in most countries, around 97% of the money supply is created by banks. And of course, it started historically with these systems where, for example, with the goldsmith bankers, whenever you have a system where people deposit valuables and the deposit receipt can easily be created at very low value because it's either paper or it's wood or something, or clay even, then there is the temptation for the issuer to issue fictitious deposit receipts.
Yeah.
This. So now we know what really this was. This little clay tablet was this big. It really had quite rounded edges as if it's been circulating. 750 grams of gold. I mean, that's almost a kilo of gold. That's like what? In dollars, I don't know, it's like $70,000 or something. So, and it's only a piece of earth. So that's brilliant. That's alchemy, which has turned earth into gold, right?
Yes, right.
So how did this happen? And this is the answer to this puzzle. Why does this deposit receipt even exist? Does the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, need a deposit receipt? No, clearly not. It's when the temple gave a loan to the government through issuing a fictitious deposit receipt. But everyone will use these deposit receipts. They were used as money.
Right.
And that's why it's important because, of course, the name of the king and the prime minister on there is for credibility, the temple.
Of course.
And that's how it could be money.
So this is kind of the same reasons we have dead presidents on United States dollar bills. There's still this imprinting of political credibility onto financial instruments today. But still there's this scheme beneath the surface. It's a different scheme now, but it sounds like this was maybe its origin point actually.
Yeah. Exactly. And so that's what happened in Babylon. So the government could acquire resources, pay for the king's household, pay the army by essentially issuing these fictitious deposit receipts. But it was the government doing it through the temple that the king could control. And the same system came about in a slightly different way in England. And of course, the paper money system in China is another version. So the English system was was really originally a tax system. When William the Conqueror had conquered England, next he was going to tax people. Well, actually, to be fair, not ordinary people. They had zero taxes. It was the rich people. And who were the rich? Well, it was his Norman barons, because they took all the land formerly from the Saxon rulers and barons. Some became outlaws. Like this is where Robin Hood, Robin of Locksley, the story, has its truthful origin, because the Saxon rulers were displaced. Some became outlaws fighting the Normans.
Yeah.
But the ruling lords who had the big estates, a lot of land, farms, they were Normans. And William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, had put them in place because they come with him. They were his fighters, the leading army key guys that helped him take over England. Not all of England. London he did not take over, which makes us very suspicious.
Yeah.
Instead, he marched up to London. He'd conquered the rest, but in London is where all the gold is and all the jewelry and wealth. And he didn't even try to conquer it. That's very strange. Of course, he had a lot of bills to pay to fund his army and his invasion, all the ships, to cross the channel. How did he pay for that? Well, my guess is it must have been the City of London paying him. And the deal obviously was the City of London will not be part of his empire, of his sovereign rule. That's the only rational explanation. Why would you conquer England except London, the one major target that you'd otherwise go straight for and forget about the rest, So that was the deal. And essentially he was told, well, you can tax England, you can tax the rest of the country. But the City of London, the square mile, which is today still separate, it's within London, a tiny territory where the Bank of England and all the banks are, became a sovereign territory outside the sovereign rule of the king. And that's true even today. So King Charles doesn't have the permission per se to enter the City of London Corporation. He has to ask for permission.
Wow.
He's not allowed to enter without permission.
That's
because it's not part of his sovereign.
There is a money power above even royal political power in London today.
Absolutely. And it's a political reality that the City of London Corporation is a sovereign territory. It's not part of the United Kingdom. We know from this, the fact that the sovereign is not allowed to enter. And it has powers over the United Kingdom because they have a deal going where they can attend all the parliamentary meetings with an unelected City of London Corporation representative. For what purpose? To make sure that nothing happens in Parliament, no law is passed that's against the interests of the City of London Corporation. Wow. That is the reality in England. So William the Conqueror had this deal, and so he couldn't touch London, or, he stuck to the deal. They funded, I guess, they must have funded his entire campaign. But he was allowed to, of course, tax the rest, and that's what he did. And of course, it was mainly his Norman barons that were now these rulers of these estates. He did a survey first, the Doomsday Book, quite an advanced survey for tax purposes of the land,
like
how big it is.
Old school census, basically.
Yeah, census, who owns it, how much can we tax is always the question. So whenever the government asks too many questions like that, what's coming next, taxes. And in Germany recently, a few years ago, they did this big survey of all the housing stock available. Everyone had to respond. It was unique, and people were quite concerned. And of course, they then started to increase property taxes, asset tax on housing, and so this the tax system was actually very sophisticated. It was the sort of center of it was the Norman Exchequer, which existed inside the Royal Treasury, which originally was in Winchester because that was the capital of England. London as a city didn't exist. There was the City of London. That's just been, ruled outside of William's domain, outside his kingdom. Then there was Westminster. Of course, later it sort of merged and became the political London. But in those days, there was only Westminster. But before Westminster became de facto the capital. It was Winchester, the old Saxon capital, where the Saxon kings are buried in the cathedral. And so he had a new cathedral built and his palace built in Winchester. And in the palace was the royal treasury with the magic exchequer. Now, the exchequer is named after the chessboard cloth that was put on a very large table, which was a giant abacus for calculating numbers, namely taxes. The taxes were gathered, the tax collectors were the sheriffs. There were the reeves, the counts, Grafen in German, the reeves of the shires, the sheriffs, shire reeves. And they had to bring the tax. Now, the system was the honest type of accounting, the single entry accounting known as charge-discharge accounting, because of the Norman Exchequer, because the sheriffs were charged. They were the accused in that court. They were summoned twice a year. And based on the Doomsday Book, there was a total amount of money they had to deliver in taxes. Of course, it was proper commercial business, so they had costs. And they could subtract the costs. There was a proper calculation, you know. All the things they did, other people they had to pay.
All their coercion cost.
Well, you have maintenance, you've got horses, you've got staff, you've got this and
but
that.
these guys are physically going out into the countryside and extorting people for money and then remitting it.
But just to make clear, it was not from ordinary people. Ordinary people had zero taxes. It was the large landowners.
Got it.
They were extorting from the large landowners, but that was the deal they had with William. I mean, they were given the land by William. Essentially the king owned all the land. That was the Norman system, and then gave it out as lien. He could actually take it back if he wanted to, but they had to pay this tax on it. But ordinary people that didn't own an estate had zero tax, so it wasn't that bad as a system. But what they then did was quite clever. So they had this big chessboard, where the calculations were done. It was essentially a giant abacus.
And this is because they're using Roman numerals still?
Exactly. And it's the same in the Chinese system, because when you have, one line is 1, 2 lines is 2, 3 lines is 3, like in both Chinese writing and Roman writing, it's very hard to do calculations. You need an abacus. So both the Romans had an abacus, and the Chinese and the Japanese, Soroban, have these abacuses for calculating. Of course, nowadays everyone uses calculators.
Well, once we got zero-based numeral system, it makes calculation a lot easier, and you don't need these.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Precisely. Now, so that was the name of the source of the name. This exchequer. The Normans were speaking French, and in French it's Czech. Is the name for chess. It's chessboard. Now, this Norman Exchequer had these 2 sessions twice a year where the sheriffs were summoned. It was a court, a high court, and there were court proceedings, and they were the accused. And in these court proceedings, they then had to bring the money or the evidence, the receipts. If they'd spent something on permitted expenditure, bring the receipts, It's just proper accounting. It was also spoken, so it was auditing, audiere, to listen. There were all the experts were listening. It was a court of audit as well. And records were made. The records were issued, were written on cowskin vellum and rolled up. It's quite thick and lasts, 1,000 years. So this was 1,000 years ago. We still have those records. They were rolled up as a counter, check. And in French, that is contre-roll, the counter roll to check. Contre-roll. This is where the word control comes from the contre-roll of the exchequer.
Fascinating.
The word check, writing a check, comes from the exchequer. And for good reason, because there were checks issued.
And audit and auditory had a connection. That was interesting
the
too.
audit comes from there. And the checks issued were the tally sticks. Now, what were they? They were essentially a wooden stick, which notches were put in, and then it was split in half. It was the split tally. That created what in Bitcoin terminology we call a public key and a private key. The longer bit, one was longer, one was shorter. The longer bit was kept in the royal treasury as a sort of public key, and or you can call that the private key. And the other one was circulating. The shorter one was the stock, from German Stock, stick, because there was a stick of wood that was circulating. Now, these tally sticks were tax receipts. So when the sheriff had paid taxes, he received the receipt. And they were valid in future, because you met twice a year, in a future exchequer session. You could use them as a receipt that you've paid tax to the government. And so they circulated as money. It also meant that the government could spend without limit. There was no budget limit. And therefore there was money creation, because the government, the king, could say, well, we need to buy some more cows, we need meat, or we need horses, whatever. You go to the estates where there's the farms and the resources. Well, okay, we acquire these. What is the price? Okay, we agree on the price. Here's your payment. It's a tally stick. It's a tax receipt, because now you've paid future taxes to the government and you can use in the future. Okay.
So they're giving them a tax credit.
Exactly. It's a tax credit. And so, of course, money is whatever you can use to pay taxes. That's another...
In the statist paradigm, yes.
Reliable definition. If you have taxes, then of money and what will be accepted for money. And it worked because you couldn't forge these because of the split tally. Because when you split the wood, it's like a fingerprint. The grain of the wood is unique. So you could always check, go back to the Royal Treasury. I think this could be fake. Okay, let's check. And you put them together. If they match, they tally. And if they don't match, so one was the stock and the one kept in the treasury was the foil. If they don't match, you were foiled.
Foiled, yeah, wow.
So all these expressions come from there.
And stockholder came from the other one,
stocks and shares comes from that tally stick.
Yeah.
Because later, when the government was then issuing government debt, it would be called a stock. Because that's how the government, because basically issuing these tax receipts was a debt that the government had.
Interesting.
And so that's where the first government bonds, came about, and they were stock, and they were called stocks.
Yes.
And then, of course, later it was used when companies do the same, okay, let's call it the same.
Yeah. Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few keystrokes. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your energy bill for 1 week per mining rig when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. And on top of this offer, you can also use code BREEDLOVE to get $100 off your first mining rig with Blockware Solutions. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-sig vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which that have unilateral control over your assets. More than just security, OnRamp simplifies inheritance and estate planning, ensuring your Bitcoin wealth moves seamlessly to your loved ones without the risk and complexities of self-custody. Easily designate beneficiaries right in the OnRamp dashboard, eliminating the need for unreliable treasure maps or other complex key sharing schemes.
You can also avoid the probate process and ensure your heirs receive their Bitcoin securely with legal title transfers designed to keep your wealth intact for generations. As Bitcoin continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly access financial services, from inheritance and insurance to trading, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security. And importantly, the onboarding process is fast and frictionless. I set up my own OnRamp account, and it was far easier than dealing with hardware wallets or traditional self-custody setups. The team walked me through everything step by step, making sure I had a secure, reliant setup for my Bitcoin wealth. Secure your generational wealth with confidence. Schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team today at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove.
It's so fat that the origins of kind of these bearer asset tax credit monetary instruments and the origins of the modern nation state go so closely together. Because what you're describing here, it is kind of this hierarchical extortion scheme, right? Where you've got the, what did you call it? The equity court, the court of equity?
Yeah, it's a high court of equity.
High court of equity, but then they're creating these sheriffs basically to go and extort people out in the country on the, land that they own, presumably. So they've lent out the land on lien, but then they go and extort people for good. So it's it's very telling about just how social organization has evolved. That we have these, history books, and often in history class, there's these kind of moral crusade stories told. We're like, oh, this country was evil and this country was good, and then the good guys won, and then the good country was set up, and this is how it worked. But that's not actually how it is. It's these payment schemes, right? It's the flow of funds that determine how society actually organizes itself.
And of course, who's in control of those, and who does the money creation? Now the Norman system was really very successful. As a result, Norman England was really wealthy. It was a high growth economy. It's fantastic wealth was created, and they used it. They were Christian. They used it to build cathedrals, unbelievable, and of course castles. The number of castles and cathedrals built in a short time period is just mind-blowing. Yeah. And it wouldn't have worked without the money creation process being used, because gold and silver, would have been insufficient. The government would not have been able to control, claim resources based on gold and silver. But in this way, the government could lay claim on resources and also motivate people, pay people, which is why it worked. So, and of course, perhaps it's a good moment to come back to the modern system. Because who didn't like this? Well, the bankers didn't like this, because the government could now issue debt without interest, without paying interest. And so the bankers were not needed. The bankers were not needed.
Yeah.
Same in Babylon. When the government issues this clay money, the bankers are not needed. They had interest, and you could borrow at interest, but they also realized, because from the government, you could borrow at interest. But they also realized that this leads to massive inequality. So whenever a king died, all the debts were cancelled. The slates were wiped clean. The Jubilee. And we adopted the system with interest, but we don't have a solution to the massive inequality that compounding interest creates, because essentially you're taking from the many, you give to the few who receive coupons and government bonds, and they have developed their own propaganda to encourage, and economics is part of this, mainstream economics, to encourage Keynesian economics, to encourage debt issuance and government debt.
Yes.
It's wonderful for those who live off government bonds.
Sure.
37 trillion in US national debt. Unbelievable.
And no Jubilee ever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and MMT, people like that, they're all about, just more spending is good. There's no downside. Just keep spending. Wow.
It's so funny.
And
it's
of course,
comical.
The usurers and rentiers living off the coupons and government bonds, they love it. Yeah, keep it coming. So now the Norman system was therefore very successful, And it lasted for centuries. The tally sticks were used right until the 19th century.
Wow.
Even when the Bank of England, as a privately owned central bank, was created, some of the shareholders paid with tally sticks. It was accepted. But of course, the bankers wanted to phase out the tally sticks because that was a competing system. Because principally, the idea is, as we said earlier, once you create a central bank, the government should stop issuing its money, its debt, its money by issuing money for spending and putting into circulation, which means there's no interest to pay, right? Should stop doing that and instead borrow from the bankers at interest.
Sure.
When the central bank comes into play, and the Bank of England was all about lending money to the government at interest,
which is still how we do it today.
Exactly, and so that's why. When the central bank is created, usually it's all about, okay, which tax are we going to introduce and how we're going to make sure there will be an income stream from taxes based on, just burdening ordinary people with this to pay that interest to the small group of people who own the central bank and the Federal Reserve.
Right.
The Federal Reserve banks are all 100% privately owned.
Yes. So you have to create demand for those monetary instruments such that there'll be reservation demand for them. Therefore, it will have purchasing power. Which is done through taxation.
The taxes,
and therefore the labor of the taxpayer becomes the collateral for that scheme, so they can actually siphon the products of human labor can be siphoned through money printing. Yeah. But people, again, it's like people don't understand that flow, so they're just use whatever money they're told to.
That's right. Now. And so, of course, if you look at the Bank of England, that essentially this system of private banking took over. And, I explained the story of the goldsmith bankers, which became the bankers. And so now that's what we have, the banks creating the money supply, the government creating no more money, and the central bank creating only a tiny amount, and the majority is created by banks through lending. That means it's very important what sort of banks you have in the country. If you have many small local banks, that's good news because that is a very decentralized system of money creation of local banks which are therefore locally accountable.
Yes.
They can't do strange and crazy stuff.
And if they do, they blow up and you don't get systemic risk as much.
Exactly. So the decentralized system is the best where you have many small banks. Also, of course, it's more egalitarian. It helps keeping this inequality in check because who's the main employer in every economy? The US economy, the German economy, Japanese economy, Chinese economy. It's always small firms. Small and medium-sized enterprises account usually for 70 to 80% of all employment. Where do they get money from? Small firms can't access capital markets because the minimum transaction fees are so high that it's impossible. But the ratios don't work. They can't justify borrowing millions when you're just a small firm. You can borrow $200,000, say, but not 10 million, right? So, but then Wall Street is not going to talk to you. You can't access capital markets because you have to pay all those fees and bonuses. So, the reality is, small firms can only get money externally, beyond the sort of family and friend circle, from banks. And that's what small banks do. Which banks lend to small firms? Only small banks. Because when a bank is big, it needs to do big deals. Otherwise, it's totally unviable commercially. The trouble, therefore, is in banking systems where the number of banks is small and we have a small number of very big banks, they want to do big business with big companies. And they're essentially not lending to small firms. So having many small banks is best. They also tend to lend for productive business investment with these small firms. And that brings me to these three scenarios we have. When money is created, it's created through bank credit. When money is created, there's three possibilities. Mainstream economics only recognizes one of them, namely, we create money, that leads to inflation. Well, that's when credit is created for consumption. Because then you have more purchasing power, more demand, but you have the same amount of goods and services. Therefore, now more people demanding goods and services, but the same amount of goods and services, you drive up the prices.
Yeah.
That's what we had in 2021, 22, based on the massive money creation of 2020 under the pretense of some worst pandemic in human history.
Yes.
So
I always like putting the L in there, plandemic, not pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. Very artificial crisis, which people say, well, then that caused all these problems, and the war, Russia and Putin, that's caused the inflation. No. It's not true at all. It's just the central banks.
That's right.
That's it. They created the money using QE of the type I originally recommended for Japan, which is why in 2020, when they saw the data in May 2020, I put out my tweet saying, well, we'll get significant inflation now in 18 months' time. There's no other way. And that's exactly what happened, irrespective of what then happened in Ukraine or other things. It's just not relevant. It was the massive money creation, this QE. Before we come to QE, actually, so there's three scenarios. So one is bank credit for consumption leads to inflation. Yes. But what about bank credit for productive business investment, like by these small firms? That doesn't lead to inflation
because you're increasing goods and services proportionate to the money supply.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have money creation, yes, but you're using it to reorganize a selection of inputs in such a way that you get a new product, because usually it's a new idea, new technology, increasing productivity. You add value.
Right.
So that the value is higher than the sum of the price of the cost of the components, right?
Yes.
So
but
there is this value
presupposing that the capital is being allocated intelligently and the businesses are successful, right, in producing goods and services.
Right. Yeah. And of course, it's not always the case, but it doesn't matter because you have large numbers, particularly when we're talking about small firm lending. It's usually over collateralized. It's the safest form of lending. There's never been a banking crisis based on too much small firm lending. And you can afford a small number of defaults there. It's not going to be a dramatic problem. It's very different when we talk about big banks and the big deals they're doing. So productive business investment is bank lending for productive business investment is the best form. It creates growth without inflation and jobs and wealth. That's really what we want.
Now, it does detract from, there's foregone price deflation, right? Because you've increased the money supply to increase the output of goods and services. Had you not increased the money supply and just increased the output of goods and services, general price levels would have declined. So that sort of gets washed when you have the expansion of the money supply to do that. So there is like a foregone benefit, but to your point, there's not price inflation per se.
Exactly. And of course, the third possibility is if banks create credit and it's not even used for GDP transactions, it's used for asset purchases to buy real estate, land. That's not part of GDP because GDP is a value-added concept. If you just change the ownership of assets, there's no value added. You just have different owners.
Asset inflation at that point, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, that also explains this puzzle of the velocity decline I mentioned at the outset. Velocity was declining, the money demand function was unstable, and also you could express it as the mystery of the missing money because the money supply grows, but GDP doesn't grow as much. Where's the money going? Well, it's because the old quantity equation, MV equals PY, is wrong.
Of course.
Even though the textbooks say, it's true by definition, always and ever. No. You're assuming all money goes into GDP. That's not true.
Right.
There are non-GDP transactions, the asset transactions, and a lot of bank credit is granted for buying assets, financial assets, real estate, and that's not part of GDP, but it does create asset inflation.
Yes.
And so
because people are trying, again, you're compromising the store value function of money when you're printing it. So people will naturally try to put their purchasing power in assets that can't be printed, like real estate, commodities, equities. So you'll get this asset inflation, which is like a means of escaping the consequences of the expansion of the money supply. So it's almost like the faster you expand the money supply, the faster you'll expand assets, depending on how concentrated wealth is.
But of course, you're not actually able to escape. You're sort of able to postpone.
Yeah.
Because what happens is this asset inflation is a Ponzi scheme. It will continue as long as you create more credit for more asset purchases. And that usually happens. So for years, this can go on, sometimes decades.
You're imputing a monetary premium to these other asset classes.
Yes, and so but really, the moment the music stops, the moment you stop lending for more asset purchases, asset prices won't rise anymore. So then initially the late coming investors that bought at the peak, they need further rises for their calculations to work out it's not happening.
Yes.
They start to default, start to get non-performing loans. The banks start to get cautious. They actually reduce credit now for asset purchases. Now asset prices start to fall.
Ponzi scheme collapses.
And then the whole thing, it just goes into reverse and you get a lot of non-performing loans. And usually from the peak, because you boost asset prices by 200-300%, from the peak they just need to drop by, I don't know, something like 20%, depending on how big the asset lending share was.
This
15% is enough. And that's enough to wipe out entirely the banking system because they only have 10% equity.
Right.
And so they're quickly gone.
This closely mirrors Mises, his Austrian business cycle theory. Basically says once you start printing money, you either have to keep printing it and keep running that Ponzi scheme until the currency hyperinflates, because if you stop at any point, you're going to get this catastrophic deflation and widespread collapse.
Yeah. What the Austrians haven't done, and same for MMT, is they have not disaggregated credit, which is what I've done in my quantity theory of disaggregated credit,
when you say
into these three different possibilities. So credit for non-GDP transactions, for assets. You have, and so you get two quantity equations. One is, first of all, I replace M with C for credit. And then subscript R, credit for the real economy, drives, that's nominal GDP. That's similar to the old equation, but you have specifically credit only for the real economy. Right. Which includes for consumption, but for investment. And then you've got CF, credit for financial or asset transactions. And that is not connected to GDP at all. That's connected to asset values and asset transactions. Yeah. And that works very well. It's very stable. We get a stable velocity. All the puzzles are solved with this equation.
That also is driving the disparity between rich and poor, right? Because you're increasing the value of assets and asset holders at the expense of those.
Of course. Exactly. Yeah. That's right. So if you want to grow an economy, which is always possible, you can always do so by increasing bank credit for productive business investment. Even at full employment, you can always have higher growth. That's, of course, how the high growth economies did it. In Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. You make sure that bank credit creation is mainly for productive business investment. And it can can expand by 15-20%, and you get 15% GDP growth for years. And of course, if you've got 15% national income growth, then you're every year. After 4.5 years, you're doubling national income. Every 4.5 years, you double national income. And that's what they did. Yeah. That's how you move from developing country status to developed country status in a generation. Amazing. You need this double-digit growth. And it's been done. And the only way to do it is credit creation for productive purposes. They did this through so-called window guidance, guidance of bank credit through the central bank, by telling the banks, no asset loans and no consumer loans. It has to be for productive business investment.
Got it. One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is Mind Lab Pro. Mind Lab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take Mind Lab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably get it. You get that Bitcoin upends everything that state-sponsored schools teach us about money. For those who get the importance of Bitcoin, it is important that we have a smart way to buy and hold Bitcoin. My friends at Coinbits, the oldest Bitcoin-only exchange in the United States, have pioneered the concept of roundups, which converts your spare change into Bitcoin. Simply connect your credit or debit cards, and your usual purchases are rounded up to the nearest dollar, letting you stack sats on every purchase without even thinking about it. Coinbits also provides a terrific self-custody experience. Connect a hardware wallet for automatic withdrawals into cold storage to minimize your risk and stay sovereign over your Bitcoin. My favorite Coinbits feature is Coinbits Plus, which gives you the best exchange rate on Bitcoin. It even gives you real-time feedback on how well you are doing on your savings plan. With Coinbits Plus, power users can save more money to buy even more Bitcoin. All that, plus peer-to-peer cash and Bitcoin payments, target orders, price alerts, and more means Coinbits can help you do almost anything you need to do with Bitcoin. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove to sign up today. Again, that is coinbits, BITS.app/breedlove. Can I ask you about...
Yep.
There's two things I want to ask you about. You tell me which order. You told the story last night about the Vikings in Paris, which I want to get on to some point. But also, I think maybe the natural place to go now is Japan, the real estate market. This was in the 80s, I think, and as it pertained to it being used as collateral for international flows, and how you came to that conclusion when this was a very serious mystery for everyone else.
Yes, yeah. Well, let's talk about that. The capital flows, and of course, I mean that's always a current story.
And you can also mix in the Japanese truth telling here that you talked about last night, which I thought was very fascinating.
Well, I learned a lot. I learned most of the things in my 12 years in Japan. Initially, as a student, in Japan they have this idea that there's two truths. The official truth, and in any official meeting, it's only going to be the official truth, which everyone knows is not true, and the real truth. And the real truth, you're allowed to speak after hours, after sort of 6, 7 o'clock. It's off the record, and that's when everyone talks straight, the real truth. But you're not supposed to quote people and say, "Oh, he said that and that." It's supposed to be off the record. And because Japan is very formalistic, there's a lot of that official truth. So people get very tired. So they're quite keen to actually, let's meet tonight. Let's talk straight, about this. It's too tiring to always be in this fictional world of official truth. And as a result, I mean, they're quite keen to tell you the real truth. That's how you learn about everything, including how central banks really work. The central bank has told me, off the record, the real truth. The banks, how the bankers do it, and all the tricks of the trade. Now, I was a student. I had this position at the Development Bank of Japan, and I had to choose a topic. And of course, at the time, this is the late 80s, end of the 1980s, Japanese capital flows were a big puzzle. Japanese money seemed to be conquering the world, but where was it coming from, and why so much money? Because it was more money than all the economic theories expected, and it was against the interest rate differentials, which usually are the main variable in the standard models. So it was a puzzle. My proposition was it's probably somehow connected to the other puzzle, which is this real estate boom. People didn't call it a bubble at the time. That's only afterwards you call it a bubble once it's burst, right? At the time, it's an asset price rise that's justified by XYZ usually, or productivity gains and all sorts of reasons, why this is justified. But it was extraordinary, the little plot of real estate in central Tokyo connected to the Imperial Palace Garden, which is not that large. I mean, it's decent, but had the same market value as the entire state of California, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, you name it.
Crazy.
Which is completely crazy. I mean, but to me, it seemed that if you have that sort of relationship, surely many Japanese landowners want to just own a little bit of foreign land because, just for diversification, because you get much more out for your money abroad.
You have a massive unrealized gain in your position. You might as well diversify.
Exactly. And so somehow I thought there's a link, but as a student, I was looking for papers or models, theories that were linking real estate and capital flows, and there was nothing. Until somebody pointed out, there's this paper by Jeffrey Sachs. He was in Japan with his, I think, PhD student Peter Boone, And they wrote a paper at MITI about it, Ministry of International Trade and Industry. So I went there to the ministry and asked around. And they, yeah, we had these Americans here, Professor Sachs, yes. And they showed me here's the discussion paper from MITI. And I thought, great, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. And these are famous, Jeffrey Sachs, famous economist. I'm just a student. And so that's fine. I'll just have a slightly different version of the same model. I'll quote him. That's fine. So initially, same idea of land bubble, capital flows extraordinary. Nobody can explain both. Surely there's a link. So then they do the analysis. Conclusion, there is no link. And why not? Well, the logic was, how did the Japanese cash in on this enormous real estate bubble in time? And they did invest abroad. So how do they cash in to then buy foreign assets? Well, you've got to sell the land. But to who? Foreigners weren't buying it because it's so ludicrously expensive. No foreigner would buy Japanese land. That's true. So then it's other Japanese buying it. But if other Japanese buying it, the money stays in Japan. Therefore, there's no link, was their conclusion. And I realized, after some divine intervention, that actually that's wrong. That's not how it works. The story is, of course, when we're talking big money, one way or another, banks are likely to be involved. And so the story is, you don't sell the land. The land is used as collateral, and the banks are creating new credit, which is new money on the back of it, and some of it spills over abroad as capital flows. And so once I'd realized that, then I looked for the data.
This was a real mystery at the time, as you're saying.
Completely.
Like people were saying, don't look into it. It's not worth it. No one can figure it out.
All the experts had told me, this is impossible. This puzzle can't be solved. All the capital flow experts and financial market experts, and Jeffrey Sachs saying the opposite. So here I was, a student who could solve the puzzle. It's still the only paper published in the Review of International Economics, 1994. Japanese asset prices, Japanese capital flows and the asset price bubble, something like that is the title. It's the only model to explain the huge surge in capital flows, but also what followed, which was a complete collapse in capital flows. And so, of course, that also couldn't be explained with standard models, but in my model, worked very well because the driving variable is bank credit for real estate purchases. And that collapsed first, and then also from the 1990s onwards, capital flows collapsed, and actually Japan became a net importer of capital. So it all goes back to bank credit. And I realized, wow, this is such a powerful variable. Surely many other things can be explained by it. And I did some tests, and I could explain, if you disaggregated, as I had done, credit for the real economy, excluding these real estate and asset credits, then explains GDP very well. And velocity doesn't decline, it's stable. So I could explain GDP growth, capital flows, and if you then look at the credit for asset transactions for real estate, I could explain asset prices very well. That's the model I've been using ever since, and it works. Now, I then developed a policy recommendation out of this, because also I realized, wow, this huge asset bubble that happened in the 80s, it's a bubble, and it's now beginning to crumble. This is going to be a banking crisis. So I was one of the first ones to point out, because you have to remember, in 1991, when I wrote this, the top 20 banks in the world were all Japanese.
Right. Yes. People thought Japan was taking over the world at this time.
Japanese money was going to buy up the world. The Japanese century, the 21st century was going to be the Japanese century.
And this is really just a giant credit bubble blown.
So my conclusion of this paper was published as an Oxford discussion paper back at Oxford in 91, was the great yen illusion, I called it, was that Japanese banks were likely to go bankrupt, and Japan was likely to move into the biggest recession since the Great Depression. And I've been using, my entire career has been built on credit creation analysis. I then became chief economist at a British investment bank. I was quickly a top in the top three, first number three, then later number one economist on Japan. Using my credit model, I could explain economic growth, which previously had been pretty difficult for people to forecast and explain what's happening in Japan. It became very, very clear, and the data is very good in Japan if you know what you're doing. And of course, I then could also apply to many other things. I mean, to analyze history, you get a completely different view. History has to be rewritten with the understanding of who is creating the money supply and who's buying those politicians. Otherwise, historians just study the front men. Okay, here's Caesar, here's Napoleon, here's Adolf Hitler, whatever. Well, why are they in power? Who's funded their rise?
Right.
Who's backing it? Follow the money.
Follow the money,
look at
find
the
the
banks.
truth. Yeah.
And you find out. And of course, particularly the First World War, Second World War, I mean, the games played by the central bankers is just really shocking. I hope we'll have another opportunity to talk about that.
Yes. No, I mean,
But what I'd like to still draw out of this and explain, is coming back to one of the points you mentioned, is quantitative easing. So I realized Japan was going to go into the biggest recession since the Great Depression. But I also realized it's unnecessary. We can quickly come out of this if you take the right steps. And that's what I then published in the Nikkei, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, as a policy recommendation, which I called quantitative easing, a new monetary policy. I called quantitative easing. Until then, the concept hadn't been used, which is to expand. I mean, basically, the audience now knows the answers. What do you need? You need credit creation for productive business investment. But your banks are now bust after all this, after the bubble, after the bad policies and credit for the wrong things, for asset purchases. Well, it's just a numerical problem, right? It's an accounting problem. We don't need to have a recession and unemployment for an accounting problem, right? So how can we make the bank balance sheets good again? The problem is the banks thought they had 100 assets. Now it's only 20 because 80 is non-performing. So no problem. So my first advice was QE1, the first version of QE, to heal the banking system balance sheets. The central bank buys the non-performing assets at face value. So the central bank buys them at 100. The banks now have 100. And, it's cash. I mean, there's the strongest balance sheet, the highest liquidity ever. So the banking system is fine. You may say, hang on, aren't you just shifting the problem to the central bank? No, because...
Well, no, you're shifting it to the taxpayer ultimately through inflation.
Well, no, there is actually no cost. This is the shocking thing. There's no cost. It's a free lunch if you want.
If the lending is done productively, which is a big
henceforth, but that's the future. You see, we're talking about the past problem.
My question would be this: wouldn't I hear what you're saying? If the lending is done productively, then it does heal.
But that's the
banking
next step.
system.
We're just talking about this cleaning the bank balance sheets.
Okay, well then maybe it's the second question. But wouldn't the decentralized free banking model be the best way to actually do that rather than?
I'm all for decentralized banking. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course you're talking about how to avoid this in the first place. Yeah. And yes, there's
right.
You have to make sure there's competition between banks, many small banks. Basically, a free banking system is a good way of dealing with this.
Right.
You could have some regulation, but within limits. Banking is totally overregulated. There's no doubt, and it's the wrong regulation. So we still have banking crises, and there will be another one. The next one is in Germany in the next 2-3 years. A massive banking crisis taking down all the banks. It's always the same game. The ECB has now done. Again, what the Bank of Japan had done first, because the bubble of the 1980s in Japan was created. Why did we have these land prices? It was the banks creating credit for asset purchases, driving up those land prices.
Right.
It was totally artificially created. But why? I researched looking for the smoking gun. Why were the banks doing this? I asked the loan officers, and that were actually loan officers in the 1980s, and they were literally giving out those loans, and they told me, we're looking back at the edge, crazy days. I was giving out these loans for companies that weren't even our customers. I cold called them, said, here's the real estate, I've done the calculation, you just sign, we give you the money, it'll go up, you'll make money, we make money. That's how aggressively they're pushing these real estate loans. And they would say things like, wow, this is really dangerous. I think we're creating a bubble there.
This sounds a lot like 2007.
Yeah, exactly. It's always the same game. So why did you do it? Oh, I had to do it. I was given orders. I was given instructions. By who? By the branch manager. Next, I interviewed the branch managers. And the branch manager said, oh, crazy days in the 80s. I was telling my loan officers to increase bank credit for real estate transactions, like massively. We're probably creating a bubble there. It was pretty risky. Well, why were you doing it? Well, I was just following orders. Headquarters were telling me, strategic planning department at the bank. Next, I went to the strategic planning department of some of the big banks. At the time, I was visiting research at the Bank of Japan, so I had a Bank of Japan name card. It was easy to arrange these meetings. So, Bank of Japan, okay, certainly. And some also I met then for dinner where they were speaking the truth. But anyway, it was because I had the Bank of Japan card, they felt they could actually say what happened because it was a Bank of Japan story, as it turns out. So the strategic planning department told me, oh, crazy days in the 80s. We were telling our branch managers to increase real estate lending like crazy. We're probably creating an asset bubble there. And you know, it's probably quite risky what we did. So why did you do it? We're just following orders. By who? Maybe the CEO of the bank? No, it was the Bank of Japan. It was the window guidance. And the key guys at the Bank of Japan, the key guy deciding this was somebody called Fukui. And they told me, by the way, this Fukui, he was doing this in the 80s. He's known as the prince. Why the prince? And they use the English word. I mean, the whole thing is Japanese, but suddenly prinsu in English, you know, prinsu desu. Why is he the prince? Because he's been selected as future governor. He'll be governor of the Bank of Japan. And these key guys, the princes of the yen, the name of my book, which you can get at quantumpublicist.com. This... And the full story with all the evidence and their eyewitness accounts by the central bankers when they were quite willing to speak about this, because I did this research in the early 90s when nobody realized this is going to really blow up big way. And so these princes were selected so early on because it was basically, this is how you run a cartel. This is how you run organized crime. It's about loyalty. They were selected 30 years before they became governor as future governor. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, there's quite a few stories surrounding that, but just to stick to this now. So the asset bubble of the 80s was created on purpose by the Bank of Japan is one of the major conclusions of my book, Princes of the Yen, which I proved with the eyewitness accounts, but also with the data, econometric analysis, and it's undisputed. Of course, it became a bestseller in Japan, number one bestseller, ahead of Harry Potter for 6 weeks. Wow. Because it was revealing the truth, how the Bank of Japan on purpose created this mess, the asset bubble, and then the crisis and recession, which is only, was still in full swing by 2001 when the book came out. And so central banks are really very much in charge. That's what you realize, you know, they're the ones that cause these problems. So the ECB has done the same in Germany, created an asset bubble by forcing the banks to increase real estate lending from 2009 to 2022. Massive expansion in real estate lending, real estate bubble in Germany. They then burst it by suddenly raising rates in 22. And the rest is going to pan out now slowly. It's going to be history. This asset bubble is going to burst. It's going to take the banking system with it. Why? Well, I learned already in 1989 from a banker. I was an intern at a bank, and this banker I was interning with had just come back from a lunch at the Bank of Japan. And he said, Richard, you know what I heard of at lunch? 1989, top 20 banks, all Japanese in the world. The Bank of Japan wants to reduce the number of the big banks. They were called city banks, big sort of money center banks.
Consolidation.
And there were more than 20, I think 23 or so. They want to reduce the number of banks from the current, 23 or so to 3. What? How's this going to happen? Well, they've achieved it.
Same pattern.
You create an asset bubble, you create a crisis. And of course, the long recession, as I show in my book, Princes of the Yen, also had the other purpose of breaking this system, which was too egalitarian for the likings of these central planners. It was a very successful system, giving a lot of wealth creation to everyone.
Right.
To the ordinary Japanese people, and they don't like that. And the idea was to break that system with a 20-year recession, which is what the central planners organized in Japan. But you can get, and really the proof is in that you could have got out of it any time using QE. So QE1 is for the central bank to purchase the non-performing assets from the banks. The banks are now whole. It's not a cost to society or to the central bank because it's not money creation. It's money creation is when the banking system creates money and is injected into the non-bank sector. This doesn't happen here. It's an interbank transaction between the central bank and the banks. There's no money creation. So it also can't lead to inflation, and it doesn't. This is what the Fed did in 2008, by the way. Bernanke was listening to my proposal. And when he became chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, that's what he did, QE1 in 2008.
So because they recapitalized the banks directly and didn't do helicopter money, it did not create inflation.
Exactly. And that's what confused a lot of people. They thought, wow, this...
But it did create a lot of asset inflation.
Of course, asset inflation, because you then have banks, and this is the next step. You can lend, but what for? And then you always back to the three possibilities. If it's for assets, you get asset inflation. If it's for consumer credit, you get inflation. If it's for productive business investment, you get growth without inflation. But that's not what they aimed at. So you have to blame the central planners again. They're the ones that see the big figures, the aggregate figures, and they can make sure the incentives are right to get the right result. But they usually want different results. Now, I was convinced that even if you did that in Japan, because the bubble was so big and the pain was going to be so big, everyone realized our bank is bust. The bankers, even if you clean up that through central bank purchases, they will still not lend. So you'll still get a credit crunch for a few years. And I came up with a proposal I call QE2, the second version of QE, in which the central bank can force credit creation through the banking system. Namely, the central bank buys assets from the non-bank sector. When this happens, this is unusual because normally a central bank only deals with banks. But if it buys assets from the non-bank sector, the banks are forced to create the money for it. My proposal was, because Tokyo is a very dense city, it's a great city, but it doesn't have many park areas and park surface space. Some beautiful parks, but in terms of compared to other big cities, it's very modest. Well, get the Bank of Japan to buy real estate because there's going to be a huge real estate slump, and turn it into parks. That's all you need. You will force the banks to create money this way because this is non-bank purchases. As the central bank now instructs the sellers of the land, their banks, we're paying money.
Right.
The banks get reserves on the asset side, and they have to credit on the liability side the deposit accounts of the seller. This is money creation.
Right.
This is how a central bank can force money creation. They didn't do it. They claimed, we can't do this. Well, how come in March 2020 they could do it? This is what all the central banks did in March 2020.
Gotcha.
This is what the Fed did, and the figures were astonishing. Massive, massive purchases of assets from the non-bank sector, forcing the banks to create enormous money, unprecedented in Fed history. And that created, 18 months later, this double-digit inflation.
Right. That plus the helicopter money. So you got asset inflation and consumer price inflation.
Well, they made sure that it was used for consumption because of all these programs. Stimulus checks and various programs encouraging people to, essentially, business were encouraged to be unproductive by shutting down supply chains. And then encouraging people to spend. Well,
what do you think?
You're going to get inflation.
Yeah, of course.
With this massive expansion in the money supply.
You only have, I think we've got about 12 minutes left here, but I want you to share your thoughts on the moral hazard implicit to all of this. The fact that, you sort of described the origins, right, that had this extortion scheme. Now we have, I guess, a less explicit extortion scheme with central banking. There is still the coercion if you try to go into the money printing business. Well, then, you'll face legal, physical consequences. And we were talking last night about how this connection between the corruption of money and the corruption of media and the corruption of academia, like it becomes very infectious that, proceeds stolen through money printing are used to create pseudoscientific paradigms like Keynesian economics to justify the money printing, which becomes this vicious loop. Could you just wax a bit on these things, like how this
Yes.
the corruption of money lends to this moral hazard and everything else.
Yes, moral hazard and extortion schemes. In fact, actually, I'm just writing on my latest Substack, which is at my Substack, rwerner.substack.com, on this extraordinary extortion scheme in the pipeline, mentioned by both the EU and the German government. So it's likely going to start in Europe first, but usually, other governments, when they see an attractive, extortion scheme, the German government and the EU commissar, the president of the European Commission, this lady von der Leyen, they talked about, Germany has all these savings, because you see, German savers like to have their money just safe in the bank. So there's a lot of cash deposits, savings deposits in the banking system. And their simplistic thinking is, that money's not used. We're going to now utilize that money. Well, how are they going to do that? And I'm going through the possibilities, which I think a lot of governments will be sadly looking at to get their hands on people's money. So we are in an era where there's increasing centralization, increasing control, but also decreasing respect for private property.
Yes.
And really they're getting ever more aggressive about laying claims on people's money. So we definitely have to expect more extortion schemes. That's coming up. Now, concerning the moral hazard question, when it comes to a banking crisis, my view is this: the banking crisis shouldn't have happened in the first place. Now that it's happened, we need to minimize additional costs from it. Like having a 20-year recession as a result of a banking crisis, that's crazy. You're adding more and more costs every year. Lost output, lost wealth creation that could have been there, which is crazy. So you need to quickly rev up the banking system again to be, and then of course, hopefully regulate it properly so it does mainly productive business investment.
Right.
Then you don't get into a crisis.
Deregulate it, to your earlier point.
Or deregulate it and make sure you have the right banking structure, namely many, many small local banks.
Yes.
That's how Germany did it. They didn't need the window guidance, credit guidance, and they got the same result by having thousands of small local banks.
Decentralization,
which is what China did. This is how China became so successful in 40 years. Deng Xiaoping, when he came to power in 1978, he said, let's forget about ideology. Let's do what works. Japan is doing so well, 20 years of double-digit growth. Germany's been doing well. Let's study that. And he did. And he traveled to Japan. He studied Germany with his experts. And they concluded, and the Japanese told him, how many banks do you have? One bank? Gosbank, like the Soviet system? One mono bank? That's not efficient. You need decentralized money creation. And he did. He listened, and he created thousands of banks, thousands of small local banks, credit unions, village banks. And they... instead of 5 people at the central bank deciding creation and allocation of the money, they had 5 million loan officers looking at a multiple of that in applications from small firms and that, for loans. And that's how you create money productively in a very diffuse process. And that's very stable. So that's the best way to do it. But once you have a banking crisis, you quickly should get out of it, and you should not use tax money for it. The moral hazard principle is whoever messes up should pay up. Did the taxpayer cause this? No. So that's why you're not allowed to use tax money. And that's why the central bank has to do it, because they messed up. It's the central bank's responsibility. Of course, it's not enough as a punishment, so you need to think of some other ways, like sacking the key central bankers who did this. That would help probably. But there's no reason why you can't use the central bank to buy up the non-performing assets. Because you see, the key point is this: when a bank gives a loan that later becomes non-performing, the mistake was at the time when the loan was given. Everything else is spilled milk. So why do you add further costs to that, like a long recession, by having a bust banking system? When the real cost already happened. In Japan, it was in the 1980s, or in Germany in recent years until 22, all this property lending. That was a mistake. It shouldn't have been done. It was done by the central banks telling the banks to do it. ECB has been adamant. They wanted to expand that, and they gave banks the regulation and also squeezed the traditional lending, forced them to essentially move into real estate, also with their interest rate policies. And so if you once we get the banking crisis in Germany, my advice will also be, let's get out of it quickly. But actually the central planners, they do the opposite. They say, oh, this happened because the banks made these mistakes, nothing to do with us. And use tax money. Taxpayers should pay for this. And also, well, that means we have too many banks now, we need to consolidate, and that's what they want. Reduce the number of banks. Of course, they want to kill. The largest number of banks in Germany, in Europe, is in Germany. And they want to kill those and essentially reduce what used to be 2,000 banks into just a small number of banks.
This is the arsonist where they often trope about central banking being like the arsonist pretending to be the firefighter, right? They create this catastrophe and then they come in and say, here's the way to clean it up. And of course, the way to clean it up completely favors further centralization of their power and control to set them up for engineering future larger crisis.
Yeah.
And it is a very, very pernicious problem. And if you go into solution space, what do we got? We got physical gold. We've got Bitcoin. Like, how do you think we should be addressing this as a species? Because obviously we're trapped. We've been in this problem pattern for over 500 years.
Yeah. And of course, the fact is also that the central planners are still aiming for further powers to be transferred to them.
Yes.
And for further increasing, their control and their centralization. Central bank digital currencies is a huge threat to mankind. We definitely have to oppose CBDCs, that's for sure. And it's necessary to oppose even digital ID because that's the intermediate step to get to CBDCs. But this is a controlled digital prison. We need to avoid that at all costs. So that's number one premise. And then how do we secure freedom and independence? Gold, I've been a fan of gold for a long time, and that continues. It seems that the schemes the central planners have been using to suppress artificially the gold price are beginning to peter out. They're in trouble. Lots of strange things happening in London with the gold market and gold derivatives. Bank of England can't deliver, all sorts of strange things. So, and of course, that's been a reason why the gold price has recently shot up again. It's still cheap. Gold is still undervalued. Think about the massive money creation we had since 2020. And gold has only doubled since, early 2020 or something. Come on.
Yeah.
It should be more like $10,000 per ounce, I would say, not just 3,000.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's one thing. Digital cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin in particular. I mean, Bitcoin is attractive as a concept. We have to just be cautious. I mean, I would say put money into Bitcoin, but be ready to cash in, for example, into gold. The moment it's surged, I think there'll be a huge surge in Bitcoin. And when it does the final run, I think it's going to have a massive run, but upwards. But after that, probably the incentives by the central bankers are such that they want to shut it down. And there will be a clampdown. They will try very hard to get all sorts of measures against it. And, when they create big crises, they can probably also, outlaw it. It's possible. And they can cause problems for it. And so I think one can play it, but one has to be ready to also cash out when we get the big run. I think it still has a good run ahead of it. Otherwise, real estate, if it's in the right country where we're not just still in the bubble phase. Germany is past the peak. It's going down, but still prices haven't actually reflected that. They will go down another 2-3 years, I think, significantly. And other markets, I mean, in the US, it'll be interesting. There's still the possibility that when there is a bigger financial crisis, and at the moment, I mean, this looks like, it could be the trigger. President Trump's trade policy is not entirely unreasonable, but it's a setup. The timing, to me, looks like a setup. The central planners pulling the plug. They already tightened credit a bit earlier, already last year and the year before in some countries. and they want a patsy, a scapegoat. And this is almost ideal.
So this will be
they will say, oh, it's
bubble.
President Trump's trade policy. I mean, on tariffs, in principle, tariffs can be very helpful if they're used to then, combine it with an industrial policy and develop your own industries, which are helped by the tariffs. We don't have that at the moment yet. I mean, we have the general idea that companies should sort of onshore again and have their factories in the US as opposed to in China. The question is whether that's going to be sufficient. There has to be sufficient policy to expand, your production domestically in order to benefit best from tariffs. Otherwise, if you're just going to restrict international trade as a result, that's of course not good for anyone. But President Trump has a point that the US has been essentially the most attractive market for everyone to export to, and all the other countries have been usually less open. I think on a country by country basis, there's a different story there, and some countries have been quite open. Japan also was still criticized, but actually that opened up after the thanks to the Bank of Japan's 20-year recession. It's now very deregulated and is quite open, and the yen is quite cheap actually. So foreign companies do have a good chance now in Japan. I think that's not really justified to have tariffs there, but overall, when there is inequality in this trade relationship, I think it makes sense to tackle that. But the way it's done and the timing, unfortunately, could mean, to me, it looks like this is the setup for the really big blowout in the financial markets, which will be blamed on President Trump as the second President Hoover, who did something similar in 31 and so on. And then the Great Depression came. Right. So there is potential
that's a
there.
Bombshell to end on, the Great Depression 2.0. What's your time frame for that?
Well, the coming few years, really.
Yeah. Okay.
We had sort of 5 years in the US in the 1930s as this panned out. But as the central planners continued to take the wrong policies, and this is what will give us indication whether, the potential is definitely there for this to happen, sadly. And the risk is also fairly high, in my view, that this will happen. Whether it will actually happen will depend on the actual policies taken. Because even if you have the worst banking crisis in history, you still can have an immediate economic recovery if you take the right central bank policies. QE1, QE2 usually is the combination. So we need to watch this carefully. I will do this, and I will write my Substacks on our Werner Substack following this up to see whether this is the big one or not. But at the moment, the potential is there.
Amazing. Richard, thank you so much for coming to Miami. This has been awesome. You're a brilliant speaker, so thank you for doing this. You mentioned your Substack, but maybe you could re-mention that and also let people know where they can find you on the internet.
Yes. So the Substack is rwerner.substack.com. It's a small fee, I think $8 per month, or cheaper if you get the year. My book, Princes of the Yen, is at quantumpublishers.com. And I've got for the academic research website, which is called professorwerner.org, and a general one called richardwerner.org, which is more general and also has some, they also have emails and contact details. I have Twitter X accounts, Scientific Econ is one, Professor Werner is another one. So please follow me there. At the moment, they're still private, which is due to the very restricted, permitted scope of discourse in academia. But I will let you in. Everyone will be let in, but I had to keep them private. So they don't grow that much, but I post quite a lot there too.
Wonderful. We'll link to all that in the show notes. Thank you again for doing this, and look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.